Marcus Antonius, better known by the anglicized name of Mark Antony, is a man who needs no introduction. Julius Caesar's right-hand man, Cleopatra's husband, and Octavian's rival. Simply put, Mark Antony is a household name, and will remain as such for the foreseeable future. Before anything else, Antony was a Roman general, and a pretty good one at that. So, the question stands. What is his greatest, stand-alone victory? The answer is a revenge campaign at the tail end of his most disastrous defeat. This is how Mark Antony conquered Armenia. To begin, we must first meet the Armenian that Antony had to defeat. His name was Artavasdes, and he was born sometime around 100 BC. He was the youngest son of the greatest king in Armenian history, Tigran the Great. His mother was Cleopatra of Pontus, making Artavasdes the grandson of the king of poison himself, Mithridates VI Eupator. Over the course of Artavasdes' early years, he witnessed as his father created the largest empire in Armenian history, watching as it fell under a Roman invasion. He also saw the downfall of his two older brothers, as they both betrayed Tigran and died a traitor's death. This left the loyal Artavasdes, the third-born son, as the inheritor of Armenia. The meaning of his name, perhaps more than anything, can explain his loyalty, as Artavasdes translates to preserving through truth. As Artavasdes entered his adult years, he was described as a well-educated man, receiving a standard Hellenistic curriculum mixed with Armenian histories. In fact, it was said that Artavasdes produced his own scholarly researched historic accounts, although if they existed, they have now been lost. He was also said to have been an accomplished playwright, with those plays also falling victim to time. In 55 BC, Tigran the Great would pass away at 85 years old, after ruling Armenia for 40 years. His title, King of Kings of Armenia, would be passed on to Artavasdes, who would now be referred to as Artavasdes II. While he was king, Artavasdes was also a vassal of Rome, as his father had been for the last 10 years of his reign. Speaking of Rome, shortly after Tigran died, the wealthiest Roman at that time arrived on the doorstep of Armenia, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Better known as just Crassus, the richest man in Rome was one of three men who made the first triumvirate, the other two being Pompey Magnus and Julius Caesar. While those two men had proven their military merit many times over, Crassus had never. He came to the east for one thing: become the first Roman to conquer the great Parthian Empire. By the next year, Crassus had made all necessary preparations to invade Parthia. In this time, King Artavasdes advised the Roman general to travel through Armenia to reach Parthia, also offering him many Armenian heavy cavalry. These two things would lessen Parthia's greatest advantage over the legions, their overwhelming cavalry. The route through Armenia was covered in mountains that would offer the Parthian horsemen minimal maneuverability, while the Armenian cataphracts could counter and destroy the lightly armored Parthians. Crassus, always the stubborn man, rejected the Armenian offer. He wanted the conquest of Parthia to be his glory alone. Beginning his march in Syria, he crossed the Tigris River into the flat and open plains of Mesopotamia. While Crassus was confidently marching on the Parthian heartland, the king of Parthia was on his own campaign. King Origenz II invaded Armenia, ensuring that Crassus would be cut off from any support from Artavasdes. He conquered Armenia and forced Artavasdes to become his vassal. In exchange, Artavasdes' sister would marry the heir apparent of Parthia, Pacorus. With Armenia subdued, Crassus continued his march until reaching the plains of Carrhae. Here, his army would be pelted by arrows day and night, as Rome would suffer one of its greatest defeats. 20,000 legionnaires died, including Crassus and his son. 10,000 were captured, and only 5,000 escaped back to Roman Syria. In comparison, the Parthians only lost a handful of men and horses. Back in Armenia, Artavasdes and Originz were celebrating the marriage that would bring their two houses together. The pair were sitting side by side, enjoying one of Artavasdes' favorite pastimes, watching a play called the Bacchae. One segment of this Greek tragedy featured a head on display. If the sources can be believed, the prop head was switched out with the head of Crassus. This was a statement to Artavasdes. Parthia is mighty enough to defeat Rome, and if you disobey, you will be the next prop in your beloved plays. Artavasdes fully understood the very clear message and remained a loyal vassal to Parthia for the next 20 years. In 38 BC, Prince Pacorus, the man who had married Artavasdes' sister, died, and this would put Armenian Parthian relations in a strange limbo state, as they now had no blood that connected their royal families. In the next year of 37 BC, King Originz would follow his son to the grave. He would be succeeded by his second-born, King Phraates IV. A year after this, a new Roman emerged in Syria, prepared to succeed where Crassus had blundered. This, of course, was Mark Antony. The Roman general had undone the name of Artavasdes, turning the usually loyal king against the Parthian Empire and onto his side. Antony's Parthian campaign would start exactly how Artavasdes would have wanted it to. The Roman would take the Armenian route through the Taurus Mountains and invade Parthia through their vassal state of Atropatene. The kingdom of Atropatene was home to King Artavasdes II's greatest rival and possible relative, a king whose name was also Artavasdes. The Parthians were completely caught off guard by the Roman invasion from Armenia and were ill-prepared to confront Antony and his army of 100,000. Artavasdes of Atropatene would flee in search of the main Parthian army, while Mark Antony besieged the city of Frata. While the Romans had successfully invaded Parthia, Mark Antony forgot to take one thing into account: the logistical nightmare it would take to supply 100,000 men over the Taurus Mountains. The man who was tasked with solving this problem would be none other than Artavasdes of Armenia. He would have to lead a multiple-mile-long caravan with assistance from 2 legions and his own 10,000-man army. The Parthians, never ones to miss an easy win, ambushed the caravan with the full weight of their army, forcing Artavasdes of Armenia to flee back to his capital of Artaxata. With no supplies or reinforcements coming to the Romans, Mark Antony decided to call for a retreat back to Armenia. The withdrawal would be costly, as a total of 32,000 legionnaires would perish by Parthian arrows, starvation, or hypothermia. When he finally arrived in Armenia with his tattered army, Antony made it clear that Artavasdes had abandoned him as he had to Crassus, projecting his own loss onto his best ally. After this disaster that in many ways mirrored Crassus, Antony called his wife, Queen Cleopatra, to send him supplies and a fresh army. After a year of recuperating, Antony sent a delegation to King Artavasdes II in 34 BC. He presented the Armenian king with his son, Alexander Helios, in hopes that Artavasdes would marry one of his daughters to the boy. Artavasdes rejected, as this could result in Rome turning Armenia into a vassal state once again. After the rejection, Antony invaded Armenia in early September. Unlike his last campaign, Antony showed a new level to his military prowess, marching on Artaxata and taking the city along with the Armenian royal family as hostages. All this was done in under 2 weeks. While King Artavasdes was Antony's prisoner, his eldest son, Artaxias, managed to escape. He fled to the enemy of his enemy, King Phraates of Parthia. Mark Antony didn't wait around to chase down Artaxias. Instead, he quickly turned back to Alexandria, hoping to show off his victory to his beloved Queen of Egypt. Antony was granted a massive triumphal parade, a tradition that was almost exclusively done in the city of Rome up until this point. King Artavasdes and his family would be the centerpiece of this procession, the Armenian family being bound together in gold chains and led through the streets until reaching the queen herself. Here, Artavasdes was supposed to get on his knees and plead for his life and his throne, where he would then become a vassal of Antony and Cleopatra. In one final act of defiance, he refused to swear fealty or plead for his life. This he likely did to protect his fleeing son, Artaxias, who knew he would try his best to reclaim Armenia. After this, Artavasdes and his family would become prisoners in Alexandria for the rest of their lives. This remained until 31 BC. After the disastrous naval battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra became desperate for allies. They took their captive king, Artavasdes, executed him, and sent his head to his namesake rival, Artavasdes of Atropatene. Mark Antony, after the death of Caesar, and after avenging Caesar, had a very unsuccessful military career. However, his Armenian campaign of 34 BC was nothing to scoff at. He conquered a decently sized kingdom in under 2 weeks. This was surely one of Antony's greatest hours. Artavasdes, on the other hand, led a life of loyalty, watching 2 disloyal brothers, stuck between 2 seething rivals, and finally given the choice of his own freedom or his son's life. Artavasdes made all of the right choices for his morals, but politics are no place for the righteous.